They laughed when a dying millionaire took in a stray Labrador from the snow-covered streets. They said he'd lost his mind. But they didn't see the dog's eyes show. They seemed to understand pain, loss, and something more. 3 months left to live, and a soul long dead inside. What happened next didn't just save his life, it changed everything. The winter he found home. The snow fell in sheets that December night, blanketing the Vermont countryside in a hush that felt almost sacred. The kind of silence that presses against your chest, heavy with the weight of things unsaid. In a mansion too large for one man, Alexander Holt stared at a diagnosis that had split his life into 3 months to live. No children, no legacy, just silence. Outside, through frost-bitten glass, a shadow moved 4 legs, low to the ground, dragging something too heavy for its frame. A stray dog, alone in the cold. He should have turned away. But for reasons he couldn't explain, he opened the door and let fate walk in on 4 trembling paws. The town of Windham, tucked in the rolling hills of southern Vermont, was wrapped in a suffocating silence that only winter could bring. Snow fell steadily, softening every edge, muting every sound. It was early December, and the temperature had plummeted to a biting 15 degrees. By twilight, the countryside lay cloaked in white, the wind slicing through branches like knives. Roads were mostly deserted. Only the occasional tire track marked someone's passage through the isolation. Alexander Holt sat alone in the back seat of a black Lincoln Town car as it glided down the 2-lane road toward his secluded estate. He stared out the window at the pine trees bowed under the weight of fresh snow. The windows fogged slightly from the heat inside, blurring the line between the insulated luxury he inhabited and the raw world outside. At 62, Alexander was a man carved from granite, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with a jaw that hadn't softened with age. His suits were always tailored, his speech always measured. He had made his fortune in biotechnology, co-founding a pharmaceutical empire before selling his shares and retiring a decade earlier. Widowed 5 years ago when cancer stole his wife Margaret, Alexander had since walled himself off from the world emotionally and physically. The sprawling, ivy-covered mansion he called home sat atop a hill surrounded by 300 acres of untouched woodland. No children, no family, only staff and silence. Earlier that morning, his physician, Dr. Nathan Greaves, had delivered the news with the caution of a man used to delivering bad tidings to powerful people. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 3 months, maybe less. Alexander had taken the news without a flicker of emotion. He had simply nodded, thanked the doctor, and asked his driver to prepare the car for a long ride. As the car rolled past the outskirts of town, Alexander leaned forward. "Slow down," he murmured. James, his driver for the past 12 years, a stout, loyal man in his 50s, glanced in the rearview mirror. "Yes, sir?" he asked. Alexander pointed to the roadside. "There." "Stop." It was nearly dark, but the headlights lit up something unusual ahead, a pale, lumbering figure dragging something behind it. As the car slowed and pulled to the side, the image sharpened. A dog, soaking wet and matted with snow, was pulling what looked like a torn plastic trash bag with its teeth. Its coat was a dirty yellow, nearly brown in places from grime and exposure. A large dog, probably 50 to 60 pounds. Labrador from the look of it, but ragged and rail-thin. Alexander opened the door before James could protest. "Sir, it's freezing. That thing could be rabid." "I'll take my chances," Alexander replied, stepping into the cold. His polished leather shoes crunched on the ice as he approached the animal slowly. The dog froze, eyes wide, body trembling. Its ribs showed clearly beneath its fur. The bag it had been dragging spilled open inside were bits of bread crust, an empty can, and a torn blanket. Not garbage, survival. Alexander crouched a few feet away. Easy, he said quietly. I'm not going to hurt you. The dog didn't move. It looked at him with eyes far too intelligent to be feral deep brown, almost human in their sadness. They didn't plead. They simply watched. He extended a gloved hand. What are you doing out here? His voice cracked in the stillness. The dog took a step back but didn't run. I'm not doing this, Alexander muttered to himself, shaking his head. Then louder, James, blanket. James grumbled, but emerged from the car with a wool blanket. Alexander took it, held it low, and approached again. Just tonight, he said to the dog, as if offering a deal. A warm bed, nothing more. The dog let him come close. When Alexander draped the blanket over its back, it flinched but didn't bolt. Then, gently, he placed one hand on its neck. The dog sighed a sound that was not a whimper, not a growl, but something weary and deeply resigned. Milo, Alexander whispered without thinking. That'll do. Back in the car, with the heater blasting and snow swirling outside, the dog curled into the blanket on the floor of the back seat, eyes half closed. Milo. The name had come from nowhere, but it felt right. James didn't speak, only glanced once in the mirror. By the time they reached the estate, the snow was falling heavier. The driveway lights flickered as they wound through the trees. The mansion appeared ahead like a haunted cathedral, its Gothic arches and stone facade softened by the frost. Inside, the staff scrambled to lay towels and clear a space by the fireplace. Alexander waved them off. I'll handle it. He led Milo into the sitting room, where a fire crackled behind iron grates. The dog looked around warily, but lay down obediently near the warmth. Alexander stood watching him. The room, always too quiet, now pulsed with something unfamiliar. Not noise exactly. Presence. Life. Just one night, he repeated to himself, pouring a glass of scotch he didn't touch. But he didn't look away from the dog. Not once. Morning came to Wyndham with a dull gray light, seeping through the tall windows of Alexander Holt's study like a reluctant promise. Snow still fell in slow, lazy spirals outside, dusting the world in quiet. Inside, the mansion was warm, silent, and still but not as empty as before. On the thick Persian rug by the fireplace, Milo lay curled tightly, his breathing slow, his eyes just barely open. Alexander sat across from him in a leather armchair, robe wrapped tight around his frame, a cup of untouched black coffee, resting on a glass side table. He hadn't slept. Not deeply, not since the diagnosis. But something about the presence of that dog had eased the usual hollowness of his waking hours. Milo stirred as Alexander leaned forward with a faint groan. The movement was small, but the dog's head lifted immediately, eyes fixed on the older man with startling alertness. Milo's gaze wasn't like most dogs. There was no subservience, no desperate pleading for attention. Instead, his look was steady, observant, as if weighing Alexander's soul against some silent truth only he knew. The Labrador's coat, though still stained and ragged, seemed slightly less dull in the morning light. His left ear was notched, likely from a fight or injury long past, and a faint scar curved across the bridge of his nose, barely visible beneath the coarse fur. At around 9:00 a.m., Martha Penwell, Alexander's longtime housekeeper, arrived to check in. Martha was in her early 60s, a stout, practical woman with short salt and pepper hair always tucked behind her ears. Her voice carried the firm but gentle tone of someone who had raised 3 sons and lost one to the war in Iraq. She rarely spoke unless necessary, but she treated the mansion like a cathedral, everything in its place, sacred and silent. When she entered the study and saw the dog, she froze. "Sir, there's a dog in the house," she said, her Midwestern drawl as dry as ever. "Yes, Martha," Alexander replied without looking up. His name is Milo. She hesitated. Should I? No, he's staying. Alexander's voice left no room for argument, though it lacked its usual frost. Martha gave a small nod, but her eyes lingered on Milo longer than necessary. Something about the dog unsettled her, not in fear, but in that odd way people sometimes recognize sorrow in another living thing. By midday, Alexander's pain had returned. It wasn't sharp, not yet, but it pressed like a stone just beneath his ribs. He stood slowly, hand bracing the wall, and made his way to the downstairs restroom where he kept a bottle of hydromorphone tucked in a hidden drawer. He hadn't used it since the diagnosis. It felt like surrender. Today, though, his body trembled in protest. As he reached for the drawer, a sound tore through the Ira, a sudden, sharp bark, followed by a low whine. Milo. The dog came bounding into the room, skidding slightly on the polished wood floor. He stopped just short of Alexander and stared at the drawer with such intensity that the older man paused. Then Milo sat and let out a low growl, not threatening, but warning. "What the hell?" Alexander muttered, then opened the drawer halfway. The pills gleamed inside their amber bottle. Milo barked again, louder this time, and pushed forward with a paw, nudging Alexander's knee, his eyes locked on the bottle. Alexander closed the drawer slowly. "You're not just some mutt from the snow, are you?" Later that afternoon, curiosity got the better of him. He called Dr. Sylvia Carrington, a retired veterinarian he'd known from his days investing in animal therapy clinics. Sylvia, now in her 70s, was a tall, rail-thin woman with steel-gray hair, always twisted into a bun, and a voice that carried more than a hint of Boston elite. She had a reputation for brilliance and a bluntness that bordered on rudeness, but she was respected by everyone who had ever met her. She arrived by evening, wrapped in a tweed coat, glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. "You dragged me into a snowstorm to look at a stray," she said without preamble as Alexander ushered her inside. "He's different," Alexander said simply. When Sylvia entered the study and saw Milo, her expression shifted. She crouched without hesitation, offering her hand palm down. Milo approached with the cautious confidence of a dog who'd learned when to trust. She examined his paws, teeth, eyes, scanned the scar over his nose, and frowned. "This dog's not street-born," she said. "See that scar? That's surgical. Could be from an embedded chip. He's been treated before. Maybe therapy, trained his calmness, posture, how he tracks your movement. You feel sick?" Alexander arched an eyebrow. "I am sick." Sylvia stood slowly. "He knows. Dogs like this are trained to respond to seizures, low blood sugar, even psychological trauma. But some develop intuition beyond that. You can't teach it. They just know." That night, Alexander sat in the study again, watching the fire flicker shadows across Milo's resting body. The pain in his abdomen had intensified, but he hadn't touched the drawer since the morning. Instead, he clutched a cup of chamomile tea Martha had brewed. Milo lifted his head and stared once more, those same knowing eyes. Not just sympathy, understanding. Alexander's voice was low. "I don't know where you came from or who left you behind, but you found the right man, and I think you know that." Milo laid his head back down but inched closer to Alexander's feet, his body warm against the chill creeping up from the floor. Outside, the snow stopped falling. Inside, for the first time in months, Alexander Holt did not feel completely alone. The snow had melted into slush by early March, turning the roads of Wyndham into slick ribbons of gray and brown. The Holt estate remained a quiet fortress, yet inside, the presence of life continued to hum. Milo had become a near-constant shadow to both Alexander and Noah, moving between them like a silent guardian. The mansion was no longer a place of echoes, it was, strangely, a home. But not all was well. It started with Milo's reaction to a familiar visitor. Dr. Patrick Ellery, Alexander's personal physician of the past 5 years, arrived for his scheduled weekly check-in routine that had continued even after the terminal diagnosis. Ellery, a man in his late 50s, carried himself with the self-assuredness of someone accustomed to control. Tall and lean, always dressed in pressed gray suits and camel-colored trench coats, he had sharp blue eyes that rarely betrayed emotion. His tone was always professional, his touch clinical, and his manner efficient, some would say cold. The moment he stepped into the foyer, Milo growled. It wasn't loud or theatrical, just a low, guttural warning from deep in the Labrador's chest. The dog positioned himself between Ellery and Alexander, his posture rigid, his gaze locked. Noah looked up from the living room couch. "He doesn't do that to anyone else." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "That's true." Ellery forced a tight smile. "Some dogs react poorly to the scent of hospitals, medications, sterile environments." "He's not some dog," Noah muttered, scratching Milo's neck. Alexander, curious but not yet suspicious, waved off the moment. But the unease lingered. During the checkup, Ellery examined Alexander's pulse, blood pressure, and reflexes with quiet precision. He scribbled something into his leather-bound notebook and handed over a white envelope. "Your next month's prescription. Same dosage." Alexander took it without comment, but his eyes lingered on the doctor's perfectly manicured fingers. Milo, who had followed them into the study, whined softly, his tail thumping once, then going still. That night, Alexander sat at his desk, the prescription bottle turning over and over in his hand. Something felt off. His fatigue had grown worse over the past 3 weeks, and the chest pains returned more often. He had chalked it up to the progression of the illness. But now, he opened the drawer, removed several old prescriptions, and began comparing dosages. The numbers didn't match. The new dosage was nearly double the original, without any corresponding test results to justify the change. A memory surfaced. 2 weeks ago, waking in a cold sweat with blurred vision. Another night when he had nearly collapsed in the library. Both incidents happened after beginning the new pills. His fingers tightened around the prescription bottle. Then, he reached for his phone. The next day, Alexander made a call to someone he hadn't spoken to in years, Dr. Julia Hammond, a former colleague from his early biotech investment days. Julia was now the director of a private medical research team in Boston and one of the few people he still trusted. Julia was in her early 40s, with a commanding presence and a no-nonsense personality. Medium height, sharp brown eyes, and a quick wit sharpened by decades of navigating male-dominated boardrooms. She agreed to review his records discreetly. 3 days later, she arrived at the mansion. She greeted him with a short, firm hug and got right to work, spreading out files and charts on the dining room table. Noah hovered nearby, fascinated, and Milo lay curled by the fireplace, ears twitching every time a page turned. Julia's brow furrowed deeper with each passing minute. "Alexander," she said, tapping the file with her pen, "your medication history has been tampered with." He nodded once. "I suspected. These doses, Patrick, increased them progressively without clear justification, and he documented symptoms that don't appear in your other reports. You could have gone into cardiac arrest. Hell, you were getting worse because of the treatment." Across the room, Milo whined and shifted closer. Alexander exhaled slowly, fingers lacing together on the table. "I want him gone, quietly, and I want a new team. One I choose." Julia nodded. "I brought 2 specialists with me, an oncologist and a diagnostic internist. We'll assemble an independent panel, run new scans, and start from scratch. I'll oversee everything myself." Alexander offered a tight smile. "Good. I've had enough of dying to know I'd rather do it on my terms." Later that afternoon, he called Ellery and dismissed him with clipped professionalism and no explanation. The doctor didn't protest. His tone remained flat, clinical as if he had expected this moment all along. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that Milo had known before anyone else. That night, Alexander sat beside Noah on the living room couch, watching flames dance in the fireplace. Milo's head rested on Noah's lap, and the boy absent-mindedly stroked his fur. "Was he really making you worse?" Noah asked quietly. Alexander nodded. "Yes, and I didn't see it. But Milo did." Alexander smiled faintly. "Yes, he did." Noah looked down at the dog, eyes full of quiet awe. "He's more than just smart. He's something else." "Some companions save you with words," Alexander murmured. "Others with silence. And some, like Milo, save you by knowing when something is wrong before you do." In the distance, the wind howled against the glass windows, but inside, the mansion stood firm, no longer just a house of walls and wealth, but of instinct, redemption, and the unexpected bond between an aging man, a wounded boy, and a dog with eyes that didn't just see, but understood. For years, Alexander Holt's mansion had stood like a museum of solitude, hushed, pristine, untouched by life. Every surface gleamed, every cushion sat uncreased, and every hallway echoed only the sound of his own footsteps. It had been built for a life once imagined: children's laughter in the halls, dinners with friends, holidays filled with cheer. But none of that had come to pass. After Margaret's death, silence moved in, like a tenant, and never left. Until now. It began subtly. The first morning after Noah's arrival, Alexander descended the staircase expecting to find an empty foyer. Instead, there were muddy footprints on the tile, small, mismatched, heading toward the kitchen. In the dining room, Milo's tail thumped rhythmically against the chair leg while the dog sat watch over Noah, who had discovered the pancake griddle and was halfway through cooking something vaguely resembling breakfast. Flour dusted the counter, and syrup had begun to pool near the edge of the table. "Do you even know what you're doing?" Alexander asked, arms crossed. Noah looked up, face sheepish but determined. "Not really, but I watched a YouTube video once at the library." Milo gave a soft bark, as if in approval. By the end of the week, the house no longer creaked with loneliness. It pulsed with movement, footsteps racing down the hall, a basketball bouncing against the garage wall, doors swinging open and shut, and Milo's nails tapping constantly against hardwood floors as he followed Noah wherever he went. Though Alexander kept his distance at first, retreating to his study under the guise of needing quiet, something inside him began to thaw. There were moments, now brief, unguarded, when he smiled. Sometimes at Noah's off-key whistling echoing through the stairwell, sometimes at the sight of Milo sprawled across the foyer rug like a noble guardian, and sometimes at nothing at all. One afternoon, as snow fell in lazy flurries outside, Alexander sat at his usual place in the library. His books lay open but unread. Across the room, Noah lay on the carpet with Milo beside him, a pile of dog-eared National Geographics spread around them. The boy had found them in a storage cabinet and was devouring every page. Occasionally, he read aloud to the dog, who listened with a seriousness that would have amused anyone else. "Did you know sea otters hold hands when they sleep so they don't drift apart?" Noah said, glancing toward Alexander. Alexander didn't look up. "I did." Noah smirked. "Of course you did. You probably built half the satellites that took those photos. I funded one of the companies that did." The boy grinned, then turned back to the magazine. Alexander watched him for a moment. There was something quietly profound in how easily Noah had adapted to the mansion, how the boy had claimed space without arrogance, asked for nothing, and yet changed everything. Later that day, Martha found Alexander in the kitchen watching Noah attempt to crack eggs without shell fragments. She was carrying a small basket of folded towels and wearing her usual apron, floral and worn at the edges. She stopped beside him, her eyes following his gaze. "He's a good one," she said softly. "He's loud," Alexander replied. "That's what you needed," she said, then walked away without waiting for a reply. That night, as Alexander sat alone in the study nursing a cup of tea, he heard laughter. Real, unrestrained laughter, Noah's voice mixed with the low huffs of Milo's playful growls. He stepped quietly into the hall and followed the sound to the back terrace. There, under the yellow porch lights, Noah was tossing snowballs into the yard while Milo chased them, leaping, catching, and returning like a retriever at play. Watching them, Alexander was struck by the simplicity of it. The boy and the dog-two souls who had known rejection and cold playing in the dark like they belonged. A few days later, Alexander awoke to a knocking on his bedroom door. It was Noah, standing barefoot, hair a tangle of curls. "You okay?" the boy asked, his voice tentative. "I'm fine," Alexander replied, startled. "Why?" Milo was howling. "Like, pacing outside your room." Alexander blinked. He hadn't even noticed the pain creeping into his chest. He rose, slower than usual, and walked toward the bathroom, Milo following close behind. He didn't reach for the medicine drawer not yet, but he knew the dog had sensed something before he did. Noah stood in the doorway, watching silently. "You two are becoming quite the team," Alexander said. Noah shrugged. "He's smarter than most people I know. I think he just knows stuff. Seems to be a theme around here." The boy offered a small smile, then disappeared down the hall, Milo trotting after him like a shadow. By the end of the month, Alexander's world had transformed. The quiet corners of the mansion now held scattered blankets, shoes near doorways, cups half full on coffee tables. Noah had found an old keyboard in the basement and occasionally tapped out haunting, clumsy melodies in the evening. He had also discovered Alexander's chess set and challenged him to a game he lost in 8 moves, but demanded a rematch the next day. Alexander complied. Each night, as snow blanketed the woods outside and the fireplace burned low, the three of them, boy and dog, sat together in the living room, saying little. They didn't have to. There was a rhythm now, unspoken but felt. The mansion had once echoed only with absence. Now it breathed with life. The snow had melted into slush by early March, turning the roads of Wyndham into slick ribbons of gray and brown. The Holt estate remained a quiet fortress, yet inside, the presence of life continued to hum. Milo had become a near-constant shadow to both Alexander and Noah, moving between them like a silent guardian. The mansion was no longer a place of echoes, it was, strangely, a home. But not all was well. It started with Milo's reaction to a familiar visitor, Dr. Patrick Ellery, Alexander's personal physician of the past 5 years, arrived for his scheduled weekly check-in routine that had continued even after the terminal diagnosis. Ellery, a man in his late 50s, carried himself with the self-assuredness of someone accustomed to control. Tall and lean, always dressed in pressed gray suits and camel-colored trench coats, he had sharp blue eyes that rarely betrayed emotion. His tone was always professional, his touch clinical, and his manner efficient, some would say cold. The moment he stepped into the foyer, Milo growled. It wasn't loud or theatrical, just a low, guttural warning from deep in the Labrador's chest. The dog positioned himself between Ellery and Alexander, his posture rigid, his gaze locked. Noah looked up from the living room couch. "He doesn't do that to anyone else." Alexander raised an eyebrow. "That's true." Ellery forced a tight smile. "Some dogs react poorly to the scent of hospitals, medications, sterile environments." "He's not some dog," Noah muttered, scratching Milo's neck. Alexander, curious but not yet suspicious, waved off the moment. But the unease lingered. During the checkup, Ellery examined Alexander's pulse, blood pressure, and reflexes with quiet precision. He scribbled something into his leather-bound notebook and handed over a white envelope. "Your next month's prescription. Same dosage." Alexander took it without comment, but his eyes lingered on the doctor's perfectly manicured fingers. Milo, who had followed them into the study, whined softly, his tail thumping once, then going still. That night, Alexander sat at his desk, the prescription bottle turning over and over in his hand. Something felt off. His fatigue had grown worse over the past 3 weeks, and the chest pains returned more often. He had chalked it up to the progression of the illness. But now, he opened the drawer, removed several old prescriptions, and began comparing dosages. The numbers didn't match. The new dosage was nearly double the original, without any corresponding test results to justify the change. A memory surfaced. 2 weeks ago, waking in a cold sweat with blurred vision. Another night when he had nearly collapsed in the library. Both incidents happened after beginning the new pills. His fingers tightened around the prescription bottle. Then, he reached for his phone. The next day, Alexander made a call to someone he hadn't spoken to in years, Dr. Julia Hammond, a former colleague from his early biotech investment days. Julia was now the director of a private medical research team in Boston and one of the few people he still trusted. Julia was in her early 40s, with a commanding presence and a no-nonsense personality. Medium height, sharp brown eyes, and a quick wit sharpened by decades of navigating male-dominated boardrooms. She agreed to review his records discreetly. 3 days later, she arrived at the mansion. She greeted him with a short, firm hug and got right to work, spreading out files and charts on the dining room table. Noah hovered nearby, fascinated, and Milo lay curled by the fireplace, ears twitching every time a page turned. Julia's brow furrowed deeper with each passing minute. "Alexander," she said, tapping the file with her pen, "your medication history has been tampered with." He nodded once. "I suspected. These doses, Patrick, increased them progressively without clear justification, and he documented symptoms that don't appear in your other reports. You could have gone into cardiac arrest. Hell, you were getting worse because of the treatment." Across the room, Milo whined and shifted closer. Alexander exhaled slowly, fingers lacing together on the table. "I want him gone, quietly, and I want a new team. One I choose." Julia nodded. "I brought 2 specialists with me, an oncologist and a diagnostic internist. We'll assemble an independent panel, run new scans, and start from scratch. I'll oversee everything myself." Alexander offered a tight smile. "Good. I've had enough of dying to know I'd rather do it on my terms." Later that afternoon, he called Ellery and dismissed him with clipped professionalism and no explanation. The doctor didn't protest. His tone remained flat, clinical as if he had expected this moment all along. But that didn't matter. What mattered was that Milo had known before anyone else. That night, Alexander sat beside Noah on the living room couch, watching flames dance in the fireplace. Milo's head rested on Noah's lap, and the boy absent-mindedly stroked his fur. "Was he really making you worse?" Noah asked quietly. Alexander nodded. "Yes, and I didn't see it. But Milo did." Alexander smiled faintly. "Yes, he did." Noah looked down at the dog, eyes full of quiet awe. "He's more than just smart. He's something else." "Some companions save you with words," Alexander murmured. "Others with silence. And some, like Milo, save you by knowing when something is wrong before you do." In the distance, the wind howled against the glass windows, but inside, the mansion stood firm, no longer just a house of walls and wealth, but of instinct, redemption, and the unexpected bond between an aging man, a wounded boy, and a dog with eyes that didn't just see, but understood. The rain came heavy and unrelenting, streaking the tall windows of the Holt mansion in watery rivers that blurred the trees outside. Spring had arrived in Wyndham with thunder and a restless wind that made the branches rattle like bones. Inside, though, the warmth of the fireplace and the now familiar presence of footsteps made the storm feel like a distant song. Noah, curled up on the floor beside Milo, had taken to brushing the dog's fur while reading from an old copy of The Call of the Wild. Milo seemed to enjoy this tale thumped occasionally, and his eyes would close at the boy's soft voice. That afternoon, as the thunder cracked close and lightning lit up the halls, Milo yelped. It was sudden, sharp, and brief. Noah dropped the book. "What's wrong, buddy?" he asked, startled. The Labrador had rolled slightly onto his side and was pawing at the base of his neck, where his fur was thickest. Noah leaned in and noticed a hard bump just under the skin. At first, he thought it was a tick, but it wasn't. It was cold, metallic. "Mr. Holt!" Noah shouted, running toward the study. Alexander looked up from his desk, now cluttered with new treatment plans and reports from Julia's team. "What is it?" "I think Milo has a chip," Noah said, breathless. "Like a real one, under his neck." 10 minutes later, Julia Hammond knelt in the kitchen with a handheld scanner she'd retrieved from her travel kit. Her short auburn hair was tied back, and her dark-rimmed glasses slid down her nose as she examined the scanner's screen. "Got it," she said. "It's a medical-grade microchip, still active. Registry number matches a former program out of Boston Children's Hospital." Alexander's brows furrowed. "Children's Hospital?" "Therapy dog program," Julia explained. "I remember reading about this. They partnered with a non-profit for canine-assisted therapy mostly for kids with long-term disabilities, emotional trauma, and terminal illnesses." Noah was sitting on the floor beside Milo again, gently stroking his side. "So, he used to be a helper?" Julia nodded. "A highly trained one, from the look of it. That would explain how he responds so intuitively to pain, anxiety, and even changes in your behavior. Therapy dogs are trained to detect subtle physiological shifts. Why would a dog like that end up dragging a garbage bag in an alley?" Alexander's voice was low. Julia tapped the screen again. "His registry was tagged, retired unclaimed, 2 years ago. His handler died. A woman named Carol Stratton, no next of kin. The hospital couldn't keep him, and the nonprofit dissolved during COVID. He was transferred to a temporary foster network, then the trail goes cold." The room was quiet. Only the sound of rain tapping the glass filled the space. Alexander stared at the Labrador, now resting with his head in Noah's lap. "He was thrown away," he said softly. Noah looked up, eyes narrowed. "Just like me." Alexander didn't respond. He didn't need to. Later that night, after Julia had left and the storm had moved out to sea, Alexander sat beside Noah in the living room. They didn't say much. Milo slept between them, twitching gently in his dreams. "You think he remembers?" Noah asked. Alexander stared into the fire. "I think he never forgot." It was Noah who started digging the next day. He found an old article online featuring Carol Stratton short, silver-haired, smiling beside Milo, who wore a tiny blue vest with the word "therapy dog" stitched in bold white letters. The article mentioned a patient named Micah, a 7-year-old boy with brittle bone disease, who credited Milo for helping him walk again after months of fear and immobility. Noah printed it and taped it to the refrigerator. "He should be remembered," the boy said, "for what he did before we found him." Over the next week, Alexander noticed changes. Milo became even more attuned, not just to him, but to Noah as well. When the boy had a nightmare, Milo was already at his side. When Alexander was too tired to get up, Milo would gently rest his head on his lap, pressing into him until he moved. One afternoon, they drove into town for groceries, something Alexander hadn't done in years. Milo sat in the back seat, head out the window. Noah was in the passenger seat, arguing about why Pop-Tarts were superior to eggs. As they passed the town's small elementary school, Milo whined and shifted anxiously. "What's up with him?" Noah asked. Alexander slowed the car. Milo barked once, sharp and clear, as a group of children crossed the street with their teacher. The Labrador wagged his tail hard enough to thump the car door. "Pull over," Noah said. "I think he wants to go out." They parked near the school fence. As soon as Alexander opened the door, Milo jumped out, not running, but walking purposefully toward the children. A young teacher noticed them and approached. She was in her early 30s, tall and athletic, with a confident stride and a face open with curiosity. Her name was Lena Carmichael, a special education aide. "That's a therapy dog," she said without being asked. "He was," Alexander replied. "We just found out." Lena crouched down as Milo approached. "He's still got it," she said with a smile, as Milo gently nuzzled the hand of a boy in a wheelchair. The child giggled, his eyes lighting up. Alexander and Noah watched silently as Milo made his way from child to child, nuzzling, sitting patiently, offering his head for pets. It was as if he'd slipped into a familiar rhythm, one his body hadn't forgotten. When they returned to the car, Noah leaned back in his seat. "He's not just helping us," he said. "He's remembering who he is." Alexander nodded. "And maybe he's helping us remember who we are too." Spring had softened the edges of Vermont. The hills surrounding Windham were coming alive with wildflowers. The air held the scent of damp earth and renewal, and the sun lingered longer in the sky. The Holt mansion, once a relic of stone and silence, now echoed with unfamiliar but welcome sounds: laughter, barking, hurried footsteps, and on occasion, the clatter of a dropped cereal bowl. It had started with a simple idea, one that Alexander Holt hadn't planned, calculated, or funded through a strategic boardroom decision. It came quietly, like a seed finding fertile ground in the heart. The week after discovering Milo's past, Lena Carmichael, the special education aide, visited the mansion for tea. She had short curls that bounced when she laughed, and an unapologetically curious mind. Dressed in a denim jacket over a sunflower yellow dress, she seemed out of place amid the marble and mahogany, yet utterly at home in the presence of Noah and Milo. She brought with her a stack of papers and a cautious question. "You ever thought about doing more with this place? I mean, look around, this house is practically a campus." Alexander, seated beside the grand piano he hadn't touched in years, sipped his tea. "More?" he asked, lifting a brow. Lena gestured around her. "You have 15 bedrooms, 4 acres of land, a library, a kitchen staff, a therapy dog with more empathy than most politicians, and if you'll forgive me saying so, whole lot of unused capacity." Noah, who was lounging on the carpet with a comic book, added, "We could help people like me." Alexander met Lena's eyes. "People like you?" "Kids who don't have homes," Noah said, matter of fact. "Or dogs that don't have people." It was the simplicity of that statement that struck him most. Alexander looked at Milo, who was sprawled across the floor, his head resting against Noah's foot. The Labrador opened one eye, as if sensing his name had been spoken. The decision came faster than he would have believed. Within days, he began converting the unused guest wing of the mansion. Walls were painted in soft greens and blues. The rooms were outfitted with bunk beds and shelves of donated books. Julia recommended a trauma counselor she trusted, Dr. Matthew Rhodes, a soft-spoken black man in his mid-40s who had once been a foster child himself. With close-cropped hair and a calm, deep voice, Matthew brought not just clinical expertise but a quiet strength that immediately settled even the most guarded child. The kitchen expanded its weekly supply orders. Martha, his longtime housekeeper and reluctant co-conspirator in this transformation, had initially protested the chaos, but soon found herself baking more than she ever had in her life: cookies, muffins, lasagnas. "If they're going to eat like wolves," she muttered one morning. "They'll at least eat well." Within 2 weeks, 3 children had arrived through discreet referrals from local shelters, each with a story carved into their posture and eyes. 10-year-old Jaden refused to speak for days. Hannah, 7, flinched at sudden sounds, and Owen, 15, wore anger like a second skin tall, lanky, and quick to challenge authority. But Milo changed the game. He greeted each child with the same calm patience he had shown Noah, sitting close but not too close, letting them come to him. By the 3rd night, Jaden was curled up against Milo in the library. By the 4th, Owen was tossing a ball down the hallway, pretending he wasn't smiling. Noah, now unofficially promoted to assistant manager of everything, took his role seriously. He gave tours, handed out toothbrushes, and taught the younger kids how to make grilled cheese without setting off the smoke alarm. One afternoon, a local journalist named Tamara Wilkins showed up. She was petite, in her late 30s, with a blunt bob haircut and a quick wit. She had been tipped off by Lena, who thought the story might inspire others. Tamara toured the grounds, interviewed Alexander in the library, and ended the piece with a quote that would echo far beyond Vermont. "This isn't a shelter," Alexander had told her. "It's a haven. For dogs, for children, for people who've forgotten they're still worthy of being loved." When the story ran in the Burlington Gazette, the calls started. Some offered donations. Others asked if they could volunteer. A few, with broken voices, asked if there was room for one more child, one more animal. Alexander and Lena drafted a loose application system. Julia's medical team remained on standby. Martha cooked in double batches. The once impossible was becoming reality. Alexander stood on the balcony one evening as dusk settled across the hills. Below, the children ran across the grass, chasing each other and Milo. He watched Noah laughing with Owen, their differences blurred in the twilight. Milo barked once, then again, joyful and wild. A warm hand slipped into his. "Lena, you named it the Haven," she said softly. "It named itself," Alexander replied. "I just listened." He still battled the illness. The pain hadn't disappeared, but it felt smaller, now like background noise, behind the hum of laughter and life. That night, a plaque was installed at the front gate, etched in brass. The Haven, a place for the forgotten to be remembered, for the lost to be found. Director of Therapy, Milo Holt. It was a crisp morning in early May when the unexpected happened. The Haven, usually buzzing with the sounds of children and the rhythmic tap of Milo's paws across the wooden floors, was wrapped in an uneasy silence. Alexander noticed it first. Standing by the French doors that opened onto the garden, his coffee had gone cold in his hand. Milo's bed by the fireplace was empty. Noah came in, rubbing sleep from his eyes and dragging a hoodie over his narrow shoulders. "Where's Milo?" he asked, voice still hoarse. Alexander didn't answer. He was already reaching for his coat. They searched the grounds, first every corridor, every playroom, every tree on the property. By noon, staff and volunteers had fanned out into the neighboring woods, calling his name. Flyers were printed. Calls were made to local shelters, animal control, even radio stations. Children cried. Hannah refused to eat. Owen punched a wall. Noah paced, refusing to sleep. It was as if the soul of the Haven had been ripped away. 3 days passed. On the 3rd evening, just before dusk, Alexander stood alone at the back gate. His illness had worsened under the weight of stress and sleeplessness, and he leaned against the iron for support. He had told no one, but he was preparing himself for the worst. Then rustling. A shadow moved across the far edge of the orchard. Then another. And then the unmistakable bark Milo's voice, hoarse and tired, but strong. Alexander's heart leapt as he watched the familiar golden shape emerge from the trees. Milo's coat was muddy, one paw limping slightly. But behind him were people 5 and total strangers at first glance, but not entirely unfamiliar in bearing. The first to approach was Dr. Caroline Miles, a tall woman in her 60s with ash-gray hair pulled into a tidy French braid. Her posture was military, and her tone was clipped with authority. "Mr. Holt?" she asked, removing her gloves as she stepped forward. Alexander nodded, stunned. Noah burst out of the house and threw his arms around Milo before saying a word, sobbing into the dog's neck. "We're a volunteer team," Dr. Miles explained. "Mobile palliative and experimental care. We used to work with a therapy unit at Boston Children's Hospital until it was shut down. Your dog found us." Alexander blinked. "He found you?" "He came right to our temporary clinic outside Montpelier. Dragged an old therapy vest from his pack-own I hadn't seen in years. Saturday at the front entrance and refused to move until someone brought him inside. We scanned his chip, checked the data. Then we read about the Haven." The others stepped forward, introducing themselves one by one. Isaiah Ike Reynolds, a gruff but warm-hearted paramedic with dark skin and salt, and pepper dreadlocks tied back neatly, who spoke little but had kind eyes. Dr. Amy Collins, a petite redhead with a steel spine and sharp mind, who handled clinical trials data for rare conditions. Jake Laramie, a veteran logistics coordinator in his 50s, who had once worked with rescue dogs after hurricanes. And Sarah Dunham, the youngest, a recent med school graduate with a gentle smile and hands that trembled slightly when she touched Milo, overwhelmed by his loyalty. Dr. Miles continued, "Your case was flagged in our shared database through Julia Hammond's lab team. When Milo arrived, we started digging. Mr. Holt, there's a trial. It's experimental, unapproved by the FDA, but it targets your form of cancer specifically. You meet all the inclusion criteria." Alexander's breath caught in his throat. Why didn't anyone tell me? It was shelved due to funding, but our team, we continued it off-grid, with private support. We don't ask for payment, we ask for commitment. And your dog made it clear you have unfinished work here. Behind her, Milo barked once, then nudged Alexander's hand. They set up the mobile unit that night. The East Wing, already home to research and education spaces, now expanded to accommodate medical equipment quietly, without disturbing the children. Julia returned to collaborate, impressed by the team's rigor. Noah shadowed Sarah during every treatment setup, asking questions, taking notes, watching Alexander closely. The first infusion was scheduled for dawn. That night, Alexander sat beside Milo on the back porch. The stars were out, clear and brilliant. Noah sat on the other side of the dog, his knees tucked into his chest. "Why do you think he went?" Noah asked quietly. Alexander rested a hand on Milo's back, "Because he remembers what it feels like to be needed, and he saw I was slipping away." Noah said nothing for a long while. Then, barely a whisper, he added, "I couldn't do this without you." Alexander didn't answer. He simply placed his hand gently on Noah's shoulder. Milo exhaled a deep sigh, laying his head between them. They stayed that way until the first light of morning began to creep across the sky. The Haven had always been a place of healing, but now it felt like a battlefield, not one with bombs or bullets, but with quiet wars against despair, against exhaustion, against death itself. The medical wing had been transformed into a carefully controlled environment where silence was punctuated by beeping monitors, whispered instructions, and the rustle of lab coats. Alexander Holt lay in a hospital bed, placed beneath the tall windows of the sunroom. Morning light filtered through linen curtains, casting long shadows on his pale face. His once broad shoulders looked thinner now, his jaw more angular, skin tinted a shade too close to gray. but his eyes remained clear, sharp, and unwilling to surrender. Dr. Caroline Miles, now overseeing his treatment, adjusted the IV slowly. "First few rounds will be hard," she said with measured calm. "This protocol is aggressive, designed to break down what doesn't belong and give the rest a chance to rise again." Noah stood by the bed, clutching a notebook filled with sketches and scribbles. He wore the same red hoodie he had when he first arrived, now too short in the sleeves. His eyes gray-blue and fiercely alert didn't leave Alexander's face. Milo lay curled at the foot of the bed. The Labrador's body was relaxed, but his ears twitched with every beep and sigh of the machines. He hadn't left the room since the first infusion, only stepping out for brief walks Noah insisted on to keep him from wearing himself down. The treatment began in silence. By the second day, the side effects hit: violent nausea, dizziness, fever that came in waves. Alexander refused sedatives, wanting to stay lucid, but it meant enduring every moment fully. His strength waned. He couldn't hold a glass without trembling. At night, his sheets soaked through with sweat. Once, he mumbled his late wife's name in his sleep. Noah heard it and sat up straighter, tightening the blanket around him. "I'm not her," Noah whispered softly, barely audible. "But I'm here." Sarah Dunham, the young medical assistant with the quiet hands, handled most of the night shifts. Her pale green eyes never wavered even when Alexander's body trembled under the weight of another round. Her calm demeanor masked the pressure she felt to not let a single mistake happen on her watch. She had grown close to Noah as well, two young souls bonded by their quiet resilience. She taught him how to read vitals and monitor IV flow. In return, he showed her how to speak to Milo without saying a word. Outside the medical wing, the haven moved with new rhythm. Martha, now head of the kitchen and logistics, ensured every child was fed and every dog was walked. She barked orders with the precision of a drill sergeant and loved with the depth of someone who had lost many and still chose to care. She had graying hair tied in a constant bun and an ever-present apron stained with flour and hope. Noah took on responsibilities beyond his age. He organized bedtime rotations for the kids, comforted Jaden when he woke screaming from old nightmares, and fed Milo each morning before Alexander stirred. He helped Isaiah Reynolds repair a broken railing on the south patio, and even convinced Owen to paint murals in the hallway, murals of animals and forests and stars. Each one added color to the once sterile walls. But the real heart of the haven was Milo. The golden Labrador seemed to know when Alexander's pain peaked. He would rest his head on Alexander's chest, breathing in sync with him. When Alexander drifted close to unconsciousness, Milo's gentle paw would nudge his shoulder, just enough to ground him in the now. Nurses began logging Milo's reactions as unofficial indicatorshi's ears would flatten seconds before an arrhythmic pulse or drop in blood pressure. "He's a damn medical barometer," Sarah said once, half in awe. On the 7th night, Alexander asked to sit up, his voice thin but steady. "Help me up, would you?" he said to Noah, who immediately adjusted the bed controls and fluffed the pillows. "I need to see the sky." Milo, sensing the shift, hopped onto the edge of the bed and rested against his legs. They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the moon rise over the trees. Then Alexander spoke again. "I didn't think I'd still be here." "You are," Noah said simply. Alexander turned to look at the boy. "Why are you still here? With me?" Noah hesitated, then answered, "Because you fight. And because when you brought me home, it was the first time someone looked at me like I wasn't broken." Milo let out a soft whine, as if adding his agreement. That night marked a turning point. The next morning, Alexander kept down a full bowl of oatmeal. His fever broke by afternoon. Sarah smiled for the first time in days. The charts showed improvement, not drastic, but real. And with that came hope. Not the loud, fireworks kind, but the quiet kind. the kind that returns like sunlight after a long storm. The early spring wind rolled gently through the streets of Rutland, Vermont, rustling fresh leaves and pulling at the pale blue banners that hung from the newly renovated gates of the Haven Foundation. A crowd had gathered donors, volunteers, neighbors, city officials, and more than a few people who had once been children without homes or hope. The once silent mansion on the hill now stood proudly behind them, its windows open, its walls alive with voices, music, and light. Alexander Holt stood at the wooden podium, a black wool coat draped over his shoulders despite the warming sun. His face, though older and still marked by the struggles of illness, held a quiet strength. His posture was straighter, his hands steadier. At his feet, as ever, lay Milohi's chin resting on his front paws, eyes half closed but alert, his golden fur catching the light like old sunlight preserved in motion. Noah stood to the side of the platform, dressed in a navy suit that made him look taller, older, but the fire in his eyes hadn't dimmed. He wore a small silver pin in the shape of a Labrador on his lapel, a gift from Sarah the day she left for Johns Hopkins to continue her medical training. He was now officially the Foundation's executive director, the youngest in its history, and, according to Martha, the only one who could boss Alexander Holt around and get away with it. Alexander leaned forward, speaking into the mic, his voice clear. 1 year ago, he began, I was preparing for death. A hush fell over the crowd. I had 3 months, maybe less. I had no family, no purpose beyond a portfolio of assets, no reason to believe anything I built would matter once I was gone. And then, he looked down at Milo, who opened one eye at the mention of his name. A half-starved dog walked out of a snowstorm and into my life. He didn't beg, he didn't bark. He just looked at me like he already knew what I needed. He turned to Noah. And then came a boy, not much older than I was when I first learned that the world doesn't wait for kindness. He didn't want a handout, he wanted a chance. And what he gave me in return was everything. There was no applause yet. The crowd was too still, too caught in the gravity of the moment. I called this place the Haven, Alexander continued, because that's what it became. Not just for me, but for children who needed healing, for animals discarded and forgotten, and for the broken pieces of myself I never thought could be made whole again. Behind him, a new mural painted across the eastern wall of the mansion came into view. Children running through a field, dogs leaping beside them, and at the center a golden Labrador, sitting calmly in the grass, watching them all. The crowd erupted in applause. After the ceremony, Alexander stepped away from the platform and into the garden where a small reception had been set up. Dr. Caroline Miles approached, her silver braid now streaked with white and a new cane in her hand. She no longer ran treatments but remained a guiding force in the Foundation's health outreach programs. You look better than most of my patients, she said dryly. I feel worse than most of them, he replied with a grin. But you're here. That I am. Milo followed at his heel, but his steps were slower these days. He was nearly 10, with a touch of white along his snout and hips that didn't move as smoothly, but his eyes still burned with the same loyal fire. And to the children at the Haven, he remained more than a mascot. He was legend. Noah joined them soon after, holding 2 glasses of lemonade. Still won't drink champagne, he said, handing one to Alexander. Old habits. Alexander clinked the glass against Noah's. To new beginnings. To the dog that started it. Don't let it go to his head, Alexander muttered, but scratched Milo behind the ears. In the months that followed, the Haven expanded. New buildings were a data veterinary wing, a trauma counseling center, a workshop and library built in honor of Lucas and Thomas, 2 former residents who now mentored younger kids from similar backgrounds. Owen taught painting. Hannah helped in the stables. All of them, in one way or another, had come through those gates broken and left with something to live for. Milo's story was written in a children's book that made it to national libraries. The Dog in the Snow, it was called, authored by Noah with illustrations donated by a former Haven resident. All proceeds went back to the foundation. One morning, a letter arrived, postmarked from New York. It was from a mother whose son had run away but returned after reading about the Haven in the news. "I don't know how you're doing it," she wrote, "but what you've built gave my son hope, and that saved his life." Alexander read the letter aloud in the library that night, surrounded by staff and children, his voice catching at the end. Hope. It was the word that had eluded him for so long. Now it was written into the walls. But as with all beautiful stories, there was something left behind, something that lingered, long after the applause faded. The sun was setting over Rutland, painting the skies in gold and lavender. In the quiet garden behind the Haven, the grass grew a little wilder now, not out of neglect, but because the children said the butterflies liked it better that way. Milo, older now, lay beneath his favorite willow tree, his breath slow, his eyes following the movement of a boy and a man in the distance. His hearing wasn't what it used to be, but he could still feel the rhythm of their voices, still knew every footstep. Alexander Holt sat on the wooden bench, his frame thinner, but posture proud. Noah stood beside him, taller now, his voice deeper, but the same gentle fire behind his eyes. "I used to be afraid of the end," Alexander said quietly. "But now, I think it just changes shape." Noah didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked toward the children racing across the lawn, laughing, shouting, alive. A dog barked joyfully. Another followed. The Haven had grown. So many lives, stitched back together. "I think the end," Noah finally said, "is only the end if you stop loving." Alexander smiled. "And we haven't." A soft bark came from the tree. Milo, as if on cue, lifted his head one last time, eyes catching the light of dusk like amber glass. Then he settled it down again, with a sigh that carried the weight of a life fully lived. A few weeks later, the Haven held a memorial under the willow tree. It wasn't somber, it was soft. Kids placed flowers. Sarah flew back from Johns Hopkins. Even Owen painted Milo's likeness on the garden wall. Ears perked, eyes kind, mouth curled in that ever-watchful smile. Underneath, Noah wrote just 5 words. He never stopped coming back. Years passed. Noah took the Haven global. New centers rose in cities far beyond Vermont, each one bearing a small brass plaque at the entrance. Founded in memory of Milo, the dog who believed in second chances. Alexander passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 74, 10 years after the doctors told him he had 3 months. His final will left everything to the Haven. His final request was simple: bury me beside Milo. That way, we'll still be waiting together for whoever else might need a place to start again. And every spring, when the lilacs bloom and the wild grass sways beneath the willow, children say they still see a golden figure in the misty morning light, tail wagging, eyes gentle, standing watch. Because some beginnings never really end.